Get the skills, be the boss. No more time to feel lost. Lead the way every day. Find success, it's here to stay. Rise and shine, it's your time. Skill up, raise the climb. Never date, innovate. It's your fate, don't be late. Get the skills, be the boss. No more time to feel lost. Lead the way every day. Find success, it's here to stay.
If you're a new manager or hoping to be a new manager, join us in our exploration into what managers need to know. This program will set you up for success by building your knowledge and confidence in the skills you need to be effective. Hello, and welcome to our 5th session on coaching for poor performance. I'm Deb Laurel, and I welcome you. And if you are here, please introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you. So the purpose of this program is to help new managers, particularly with management concepts, tools, and tips that will help them be successful. And we had looked at delegation for our first series, and we're now concluding our second series by looking at coaching for poor performance. About me, I taught for the Executive Management Institute and the Small Business Development Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Business for 30 years as an ad hoc instructor. And I've been a workplace learning and performance improvement consultant with my own business for quite a while. In our first session, we looked at what coaching involves and that there were 3 areas of interest where we train, we develop, and we problem solve. And then we focused on the problem solving part because having to deal with difficult employees and poor performance is the bane of a manager's existence. We looked at why coach from the standpoint of how it benefits the employee, the organization, and you as the manager. When to coach, what are those triggers, and when are times where coaching is not going to work? And those times are when the employee is unwilling to be coached because coaching involves a mutual collaborative experience. We looked at the do coach model, how to prepare for coaching and how to conduct that coaching conversation. And now we're looking at how to handle defensive responses because nobody likes to be told that they're not performing well, even if they've got a clue that they aren't. And it can be very uncomfortable for a manager, for us, to deal with the defensiveness of an employee. So the first caution is to proceed very carefully because very often the first response of that employee is going to be denial because that gets them off the hook, at least from their standpoint. Others react to criticism with anger and aggression, and that can be very frightening when you're at the receiving end of that anger. And then there are others who retreat into a shell and refuse to communicate, which can be even more frustrating for a manager. Because when you can't even have a conversation, it's hard to get to some point. So how to handle a defensive employee? First of all, we're human beings and being defensive is normal. And it's very unwise to attack a person's defenses. Let them have that defense, whatever it is, and just concentrate on the performance issue that's of concern, not on the person and how they're reacting to you. Postpone action. Sometimes it's better to let a little bit of time pass. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you not revisit it. But if the person is too angry, if the person is too withdrawn, if the person is too upset, it's not going to be a very fulfilling and fruitful conversation. It's also important for you to recognize your own limitations. You may not be able to solve every problem that comes up. You're going to see in looking at some of the common defensive responses that employees have, that sometimes the best thing to do is just send them home and live to fight another day. So we're going to look at 5 typical defensive reactions. There are many, of course, but these are the key ones that come up very often. And the first is anger. It's important that you stay calm. And it's very useful to have a third party there as an impartial observer. I had a supervisor, and I think I mentioned this in earlier sessions. I had a supervisor who came to me and said that he had to talk to an employee who always got very, very angry and obnoxious and yelled at him, and he just couldn't take that. And I said, well, have you ever thought about having someone else there? Because that kept her calm. Didn't keep her less angry, but kept her calm and kept the conversation more objective. Make sure that your safety is not in jeopardy. I don't know, very often, if you're talking about an office and everybody's on site and you're having that conversation there, the manager's desk is in the back of the room and the door is in front of them. Well, if the person is standing near the door, you can't get out. So you want that person seated next to you. Okay? You want to have a safe time and location where if you needed help, someone would be available. Now here we're talking about anger that could become very volatile and could become very violent. And hopefully you never have to experience that. But you also have to keep in mind, sometimes things can escalate and you want to be in a safe position. If you anticipate that kind of behavior, establish ground rules. No raised voices, no profane language, no threats, no violence. Stick to the issue. Let each other speak without interruption. Listen. Set a time limit on what this conversation is going to take. Identify that you will terminate the meeting if the rules are broken or if the meeting is not productive, and identify the consequences if that employee terminates the meeting by storming out. Use I statements. This is how I feel. This is what I think. This is what I've seen. Actively listen to the employee's concerns. It can be helpful if you're able to go for a walk with that employee because it helps dissipate some of that energy and that anger. And if it gets out of control, sending the employee home. Now, this does not mean you don't deal with the performance issue. You know, it still has to be addressed, but whether it's addressed in a grievance, in an appeal, in disciplinary action, that's going to be up to your organization's policies and procedures. Another typical defensive reaction is blaming others. Again, it helps to have an objective, neutral third party present and thinking about walking while talking and sending the employee home if it gets out of control. But when you anticipate this disruptive behavior, again, set those ground rules we already discussed. Actively listen to the employee's concerns, and then provide enough facts and information so that this person is no longer misinformed. But I think the most important thing is refuse to discuss any other employee. The issue under consideration is that person's behavior. So focus on the real issue and problem solve. Acknowledge and dismiss non-relevant comments, and then document the conversation so you don't have to relive it later. And documenting the conversation in all of these situations is wise. State that they should only present constructive recommendations if they have a concern. Stay calm. Allow the employee to vent, and reinforce the employee when he or she has solutions. You'll notice these are not in any particular order. These are different techniques you can use depending on what seems most appropriate at the time. Crying and falling apart. You want to give the person some time to get control. If they stay and cry, hand them some tissues. But don't let that manipulate you. For some managers, particularly male managers, when a woman employee cries, that gets them off kilter. They don't like to see that. Socially, they don't feel that that's reflecting well on them. So just let that person cry. That's their defensive response. And it's not your fault. And there's nothing to feel guilty about. You can let the employee know you realize that he or she's upset, but that we still have to deal with it. And sometimes just talking while the employee pulls themselves together can work. You can delay the meeting until a specific time later. Give that person 10 or 20 minutes to pull themselves together. Time the meeting to allow the person some dignity. If you know that this is someone who is likely to cry, this is a kind thing to do. Give the person permission not to respond immediately. Sometimes when people are crying, it's hard for them to talk. Right? Consider getting a written response option for them. And here again, we've got to send the person home. I'm not going to say that that's the best way to deal with things, just sending the employee home. But in the case of the person crying and falling apart, they certainly need some time to pull themselves together. And they may not be able to speak because they're so upset. So a written response would be a wise thing to offer. How about when they blame you? You're riding me. This is not my fault. You did this. Recognize the person's upset. Use active listening. Reframe a verbal attack on you as an attack on the problem. When you hear, this is all your fault, you could respond, it's certainly true, this has been difficult for all of us. Reframe from past wrongs to future remedies. And these are negotiation techniques. They say, you never listened to us. I'm sorry that you feel that way. What can we do now to avoid that problem in the future? but we don't want to be distracted from the situation we need to talk about. You want to ignore any personal attacks. In all of these are suggestions of how to handle that, what might be the final coaching conversation when we're dealing with poor performance. What happens afterwards? If the person hasn't heard it, isn't going to respond appropriately, doesn't recognize and admit that there's a problem that needs to be solved, then coaching can't occur, and we are into some disciplinary mode. And refusing to respond, which can be very frustrating. State your concerns and needs. State the various options you see to resolve the problem. And indicate what you plan to do if the employee is unwilling to select an option. Explain the consequences if the employee chooses not to cooperate with the coaching process. And allow the employee the option to respond in writing by a specific time. If that employee continues to be silent, tell the employee what you think and expect, and that you will assume that his or her silence means agreement unless the employee says otherwise. This can be a very good tactic to use. Ask questions. You can reschedule for a specific time later when you say you expect that there will be a fruitful conversation. Okay, if the employee is fearful, state the problem and then be supportive. But what's important here is that we need a response from the employee, and it either needs to be in word or in writing. You can have a third party there for moral support or mediation. That might make the employee feel more comfortable speaking up. Meet in a neutral location. You can state your expectations in writing and label the behavior. Now, please keep in mind, you've got to do what is most comfortable for you. We've been talking about coaching as a mutual dialogue where both people have to feel they're part of the solution. If the employee chooses not to engage, not to participate, then that's a choice. And we need to say, if you're choosing not to communicate, if you're choosing not to participate in this coaching experience, then you have chosen what actions will follow. And those actions are thus. We're going to initiate disciplinary action. To the extent possible, you want to avoid that. Sometimes poor performance is not the sole responsibility of the employee. They may not have been set up for success, and this is an opportunity to have that conversation if it hasn't occurred earlier. And by this, I mean, maybe the expectations for performance were not appropriate, were not realistic, given system constraints, processes, difficulties, weather. Could be a number of things. So we want to have that employee engage in conversation. We want to get past that defensive response. So do you have any questions or comments? All right. Then please think about what your key takeaway is from this discussion of how to handle defensive reactions and responses from employees. Our intent when we sit down with that employee is to get some resolution. And that resolution we want is for them to change their behavior. And changing their behavior may involve additional problem solving. It may involve training. It may involve guiding. But that's what we want. And we want to get past the defensive response so the person sits with us and has an objective conversation that leads to some constructive solution. That concludes our look at coaching for poor performance. What we will be starting next week is looking at motivational skills. In the first week, we're going to look at what your needs are, because it's very difficult to motivate someone else if you're not motivated yourself. And sometimes we forget, with the frustrations of our job and other issues impinging on our emotions, we forget really what makes us tick, what is important for us in our jobs. Then in the second week, we'll look at primary motivators. 99% of employees are motivated by 7 different primary motivators. So if we know what those are, we can set up a motivational environment that's going to be effective. Then we're going to look on the third and the fourth weeks at motivational tools, different things that you can do that create a motivation within the employee, because we're going to be looking at motivation as being intrinsic, something that an employee does for themselves. We can create various environments, incentives, consequences, but what really makes an employee motivated is what's within them. So we'll look at different motivational tools, how we set people up for success, how we give them feedback so they know they're successful, how we raise their interest, how we lower or raise their concern, how we create a positive feeling. All of these things are intended to create a motivational environment. And then we're going to end that series by looking at how to encourage employees. You know, there is a lot going on these days that can impact an employee's motivation, and it can be very discouraging on a number of levels. So how do we encourage employees? And then we'll have you assess yourself in terms of how well you do at creating a motivational environment for your employees and what you can do to fix that if you're not. So I thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we begin our look at motivational tools. Thank you so much for coming and participating in our discussion of what managers need to know. You can find the videos of this and previous sessions on my YouTube channel or under events on my LinkedIn profile. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Get the skills, be the boss, no more time to feel lost. Lead the way, every day, find success, it's here to stay. Get the skills, be the boss, no more time to feel lost. Lead the way, every day, find success, it's here to stay. It's here to stay. Oh, it's here to stay. It's here to stay. Be the boss, no more time to feel lost.